Hello, everyone. Welcome. And I'm sharing my screen. And right now we're going to finish chapter 3 and answer a couple of questions. Um, we did in the previous video, we did Cobb Douglas and what that implies for the shares of income of labor and capital, as well as of course the relationship between labor productivity and the real wage. And that kind of answers the question on where was that? What determines the level of production and how income from production is distributed to workers and owners of capital. So now we will go to the expenditure side. So from output to how the production is used. So as a recap, what determines level of production is technology and inputs, and an assumption that in this long run, all inputs are effectively and efficiently used, and therefore Y happens to be the limit of what technology will give us, right, or GDP. And then how will this income be distributed? It will be distributed according to the marginal products of labor and capital. In a market, okay, wherein there's no market power, right? And then each individual company or firm will hire up until when the real wage equals the marginal product of the input, right? Real wage or real rental in this case. Yes, so that's pretty much it. Again, I invite you to really think about Cobb Douglas, because that will show up in questions for this chapter, as well as questions in the last part of this course, which is economic growth. Okay, next. Given that we have Y, this income now, right? How will this be divided into aggregate consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports, right? We've seen in the measurement that indeed Y or real GDP can be divided into these buckets or these categories. Next, we will assume first a closed economy, an economy that does not trade with others. In about a couple weeks, 2.5 weeks, we will talk about an open economy in chapter 5. So in this closed economy, we have 3 uses for the goods and services. It's C, I, and G. So NX we'll assume to be 0 for now, and that's why it's a closed economy for now. And the big question is, how is GDP allocated amongst these uses? So first is consumption. Income can be used to consume. When we eat food, wear clothing, go to a movie, we're consuming some of the output in the economy. All forms of consumption together make up about 2/3 of GDP. So I invite you to look at the components of GDP and to figure out what the share of consumption, private household consumption is in the Philippines. It will roughly be the same. I believe we computed this in some other class and we found it's pretty much the same. Oh. So households receive income from their labor and their ownership of capital, pay taxes to the government, and decide how much of their after-tax income to consume and how much to save. Okay. Here we will do a simplified version of that, and that households receives the output of the economy Y. Okay. The government then taxes households an amount T. Okay. For our purposes, we can lump all these taxes together, right? In a micro class, it's very important what kind of tax it is, and I would suggest that it is quite important. But in this sort of simplified long-run situation, we will just lump everything together as capital T, as all of the taxes. Okay. We define income after taxes to be Y minus T, and we call that disposable income. And then here we have that our consumption is a function of this disposable income. So notice that consumption is not a function of income, but disposable income, right? So the higher the tax level, the less the disposable income is, and the less consumption is. So that basically, the more money, the more disposable income you have, the more consumption it allows you to have. So we have this parameter called the marginal propensity to consume. It's the amount by which consumption changes when a disposable income rises by $1. MPC is between 0 and 1. An extra dollar of income increases consumption, but by less than $1 or 1 peso. For example, if MPC is 0.7, then households spend 70 cents of each additional peso of disposable income on consumer goods and services and saves 30 cents. So figure 3-6 illustrates the consumption function. So let's check it out. It's very simple. It's y here, x-axis, I should say. X-axis is a function of y minus t, or disposable income. The y-axis is consumption. Notice that the slope here is less than 1 because the MPC is less than 1. The slope of the consumption function is the marginal propensity to consume. It's not so clear here, but you may think of this, for instance, as 0 in this part of the graph. This is the origin. And what this graph suggests, if this is 0, is that even if disposable income is 0, then you can imagine some kind of minimum consumption by households here. And that sort of minimum consumption, or sort of autonomous consumption, consumption that's not related to disposable income, will play a role later on in the course. Next, investment. So both firms and households purchase investment goods. Firms buy investment goods to add to their stock of capital and replace capital as it wears out. Meanwhile, households buy new houses, which are also part of investment. So the quantity of the investment goods demanded depends on the interest rate, which measures the cost of funds used to finance investment. For an investment project to be profitable, its return must exceed its cost. If the interest rate rises, fewer investment projects are profitable, and the quantity of investment goods demanded falls. So you can consider the interest rate as sort of the price or the cost of investing. And the higher the interest rate is, the higher the cost of funds used to finance investment. And there's an example here, essentially saying that, right, the cost of borrowing goes up with a higher interest rate. Now, one important thing that we're thinking about here is we're thinking about the real interest rate, okay? Economists distinguish between the nominal and the real interest rate. This distinction is relevant when the overall level of prices is changing. The nominal rate or nominal interest rate is the interest rate that is usually reported. The real interest rate is the nominal interest rate corrected for the effects of inflation. If the nominal interest rate is 8 and inflation is 3, then the real interest rate is approximately 5%. So this is an approximation. 8 minus 3 is 5. In Chapter 4, we will discuss the relation between nominal and real interest rates in more detail. So we'll pause that discussion. Except that here, we are relating investment to the real interest rate here. So the real cost of borrowing, right, not the nominal cost of borrowing. And as you can see, if this is the real interest rate in the y-axis, investment falls as interest rate or the real interest rate goes up, right? So investment goes down, moves to the left, if real interest rate goes up. And likewise, if the real interest rate falls, then the quantity of investment goes up. Government purchases are the third component of the demand for goods and services. The federal government buys guns, everything, services, education, right? Governments at all levels build roads and public works. So in the Philippines, I think it is also about 20 to 30% of GDP. So it's one of the single largest components of GDP. So transfer payments do not affect the demand for goods and services directly. Transfer payments are the opposite of taxes. They increase households' disposable income just as taxes reduce disposable income. So an increase in transfer payments financed by an increase in taxes leaves disposable income unchanged. So we can revise our definition of T to equal taxes minus transfer payments. Disposable income Y minus T includes both the negative impact of taxes and the positive impact of transfer payments. Next is, if the government purchases equal taxes minus transfers, then G equals T, and the government has a balanced budget. So spending of the government equals the net take here, right? If G exceeds T, the government runs a budget deficit, which it funds by issuing debt, borrowing money. So in the Philippine case, we tend to have budget deficits, and we tend to issue debt, which we tend to roll over. Okay, so more of this later on in the course. That is, well, borrowing in the financial markets, that's what issuing debt is. If G is less than T, then the government runs a surplus or budget surplus, which it can use to repay some of its outstanding debt. So in this case, we will put G as G bar, which is some exogenous variable, and T as T bar, which is also some exogenous variable. We would want to examine the impact of fiscal policy on the endogenous variables. So changes in G, the changes in Y, and changes in C. The endogenous variables here are consumption, investment, and interest rate. I stand corrected. The endogenous variables are consumption, investment, interest rate, not GDP at this point, because at this point, GDP, like we said, is a function of the inputs and technology. So Y is unchanged. It's really just the components of Y that's moving around as G is moving around. Okay, and that determines the division of income amongst those three things, C, I, and G. Now, what brings the supply and demand for goods and services into equilibrium? So there are two ways of doing this, right? We've well, it's not two ways of doing this. What you've seen here is what we need to answer is this question. In other words, what ensures that the sum of consumption, investment, and government purchases equals the amount of output produced, right? Why is Y equal to C, I, and G? What we will see here in this classical model, the interest rate, the real interest rate, is the price that has a crucial role of equilibrating supply and demand. So there are two ways to think about the role of the interest rate in the economy. We can consider how the interest rate affects the supply and demand for goods and services, or we can see how the interest rate affects the supply and demand for loanable funds. As we can see, these two approaches are two sides of the same coin. So what this paragraph is actually quite important. What it's saying is that there are two markets. Okay. There are two markets in the economy remaining, right? After the factor markets, you've got now the supply and demand for goods and services, and then finally the demand for loanable funds or investment demand. Yeah. So what we can say is that if one of these markets is in equilibrium, the other one is as well. So that's the sense in which they're two sides of the same coin, right? Because if factor markets are in equilibrium, the goods and services market are also in equilibrium, it must be that the third market, or the loanable funds market, is also in equilibrium. So here's the demand and supply for the economy's output. Here you have the model that we just described earlier written down. It's Y equals C plus I plus G. And here I reiterate this Y here is actually fixed, and it will be clearer later that it's fixed, right? C plus I plus G, C is this, which is a function of disposable income. Investment is a function of the real interest rate. Then you have government spending and taxes, both of which are exogenous. And here, like I promised, Y is basically Y bar because it's determined by technology and inputs. Putting it together, we essentially get this equation here, which is y bar equals c, y bar minus t bar, plus IR plus G. So what do we notice here? If GDP is fixed, then disposable income at this point is also fixed. If disposable income is fixed, then consumption is fixed. Consumption is fixed and G is fixed. And therefore, the only thing that is not fixed is I. So it is I that moves up and down to make sure that C plus I plus G equals Y. So the secret to the model is already here in this equation. So the interest R is the only variable that's not determined. It has a key role to play. It will ensure that demands for goods and services equal to the supply. The greater the interest rate, the lower investment is, and thus the lower the demand for goods and services, C plus I plus G. If the interest rate is high, the investment is low, then the demand for output falls short of the supply. If the interest rate is too low, the investment is too high and demand exceeds the supply. Okay. At the equilibrium interest rate, the demand for goods and services equals the supply. So again, to be clear, when we say demand and supply here, the left-hand side is the supply, and the right-hand side here is the demand. See? These are the demand for goods and services, because consumption is how much you want to consume, investment is how much you want to invest, and G is how much the government wants to consume and invest. This is the demand for input for the output of the economy, and here at Y bar is the supply. And the supply of the output is fixed. So the only thing that can equilibrate the left-hand side and the right-hand side is R, which changes investment. So as you can see here, another way of viewing this is the supply and demand for loanable funds. You can rearrange the earlier equation into this. And Y minus C minus G, that's just what's called national saving. And national saving, you can divide into two parts, this one and this one. Y minus T minus C, we call that private saving. So that's income by households minus T, which is the tax, right? So Y minus T is now disposable income. And from disposable income, you subtract consumption. And whatever you don't consume from disposable income, that's called your private saving. Public saving instead will be T minus G. If T is greater than G, then that means the public or the government is saving some amount. To see how the interest rate brings financial markets into equilibrium, okay, so notice that here is the supply for loanable funds, and to the right is the demand for loanable funds. Meaning, if you are investing, there's really only one source to finance that investment, either private savings or public savings, or even another way to view it, if this is the investment demand, there's really only one source. It's really the supply of investable funds, which is savings. Whatever is savings, that's the source of all the money that the economy can use to invest in the economy. That's especially true in this closed economy. There's no other source of money. Now, in an open economy, there is another source of money, which is foreigners. And the foreigners can come in and invest domestically. Right? But we're saying, wala mo na yun, and X is 0. All right, so we go back to here. The left-hand side will be S, and the right-hand side will be I. And what you can see here is that S bar, which is the national savings, happens to be exogenous because Y is constant, T is constant, and G is constant. Therefore, S bar is just some number. And you're looking for the real interest rate for which S equals I, or savings equals investment. And this is the loanable funds market here. S is equal to I at the equilibrium interest rate, R. And here you have this graph, again, of savings and investment. In fact, I must say that this is the preferred way of showing macroeconomic equilibrium. Like I mentioned earlier, this is the supply and demand for investable funds. If this is in equilibrium, it should be clear that it also must mean that GDP equals C plus I plus G, right? That has to be the case because this loanable funds market, when it clears, then it must be that demand and supply for goods also clears. Okay? Because essentially they're the same equations, just manipulated in a different way. Now, what we've got here is savings as this vertical line, S bar. And then here's your investment schedule or investment function. And R is determined such that I equals S. Okay, so the endogenous variable here is the real interest rate. The next parts of this chapter is about changes in the exogenous variables, how it will affect the real interest rate. So in this case, if there are changes in the savings, an increase in government purchases lowers public saving. And there's a fall in saving here. And a fall in saving here must mean that investment also must go down because S must equal I. And what will cause investment to go down? A higher real interest rate here. Okay. A decrease in taxes would also tend to lower public saving, right? But check this out. Consider a reduction in taxes, disposable income. Well, first we'll focus on disposable income. Disposable income rises by change in T. Consumption rises by change in T times MPC. We'll do this homework question in a moment. Maybe it will be clearer then. But basically what we're saying is that because the economy's output is fixed, for investment to fall, the interest rate must rise. Hence, a reduction in taxes, like an increase in government purchases, crowds out investment and raises the interest rate. We can also analyze the effect of a tax cut by looking at savings and investment, because a tax cut raises disposable income by change in T. Consumption goes up by MPC times change in T. Savings, which equals Y minus C minus G, falls, right? Because C goes up, then S goes down. And as you can see, if S goes down, then the reduction in savings shift the supply of loanable funds to the left, which increases the equilibrium interest rate and crowds out investment. Okay. You can also, and what you should really do actually is look at not just that, but the change. Oh yeah, that's it. Changes in national savings, which equal. You can, what I wanted to say was you can turn this national savings term into this term here. Where is it? This term. National savings is the private, okay, and the public. You can turn this national savings into this, and it will deliver the same thing. An increase in T lowers, sorry, is it an increase? What is our thing? Let me just double check. A decrease in T. A decrease in T increases your disposable income, which increases, lowers your disposable income, which tends to increase consumption. And this will tend to lower savings. And what this is saying is that this lowered savings here, you have a lower savings here and a lower savings here because T went down. And the sum of this private saving and the public saving is both negative, right? As the text implies here. Check this out. If there's a decrease in taxes, then that means, okay, the tax raises disposable income by this and consumption rises by this much. Okay. And if consumption rises by this much, then national savings will fall. So the sum of private and public savings will go down, right? Because national saving will fall as consumption goes up, as taxes falls, and disposable income goes up. All right. So if national savings goes down, then it's in figure 3-9. Where's figure 3-9? Basically the same thing. National savings will shift to the left. Investment must also fall. In order for that to happen, the real interest rate must go up. Okay. The final thing here is what will happen when you have a change in the desired investment level, right? For any given real interest rate, you want to invest more for a given savings rate, and savings is the source of the funds, right? There is no other source for the funds, and therefore an increase in investment must mean that the price of investment will go up in equilibrium. This, I believe, is the more general form, right? So in this case, you'll find that the savings rate is a positive function of R, or the real interest rate. So what this means is that a higher real interest rate encourages savings, because the households are lending money to the private sector at rate R. And the rate R would then be, instead of a cost, it would be this benefit, right? That's how much you will get if you invest or if you save as a household. And meanwhile, it's still a cost, of course, for businesses. As R goes up, the cost of investing rises, and therefore investment falls. The quantity investment falls. So in this particular case, if you have an increase in desired investment, similar to the case above, there would be two effects, right? It would increase the cost of investing, okay? Or in this case, for the household's point of view, the returns to savings. It would also increase both investment and savings from this lower level to this higher level. So I would argue that this is a sort of a more general case where national savings, Y minus C minus G, is affected by R. Right? You can think about this as R affecting both private saving and public saving. All right, so we are arrived at the conclusion. I invite you to read this. There's a bunch of simplifications that we've done, which we have not addressed yet. And in chapter 4, we will go now to the role of money and to determine what determines the price level. So now we'll expand our GDP determination model into a determination of prices and inflation as well. All right, so let's talk about a few questions. And again, I invite you to answer a bunch of these questions, and we'll not completely answer any of the stuff. So let's go to some, I guess, I guess a question on the neoclassical theory of distribution to make sure everyone gets it. Okay. So according to the neoclassical theory of distribution, the real wage earned by any worker equals that worker's marginal productivity. So let's use this insight to examine the incomes of two groups, farmers and barbers. So in this case, there's not one sector, right? There's two. Okay, so GDP is composed of the output of farmers and the output of barbers. Now, over the past century, the productivity of farmers has risen substantially because of technological progress. According to the neoclassical theory, what should have happened to their real wage? So I will jump to this one. And I've written here the core equation from that part of the chapter. This is the real wage of barbers and must be equal to the marginal product of labor amongst barbers. And the same one for farmers. And what this is saying is that if the productivity of farmers has risen, that means MPL, the marginal product of labor, which is the direct measure of productivity, a theoretical measure of productivity, which can be estimated using real data, this one will tend to go up. If this goes up, then that means the right-hand side will go up. So the real wages of farmers will go up in this situation. So the more productive farmers are, they will benefit in terms of higher real wages. What units is the real wage? We've also discussed this in class. This is money per worker, and this is price, which is money per output of farmers, say wheat. So this one will be wheat per worker. Okay, so that's the unit, right? A real goods per worker, per labor. Over the same period, the productivity of barbers has remained constant. What should have happened to their real wage? Well, based on this, if the productivity of the barber, I should say here, is constant, then WB over PB has to be the same, equal. Next, in what units is the real wage in C? It's the same. This time it's the output per barber of the barber per worker in this industry, in the barber industry. Suppose workers can move freely between being farmers and barbers. What does this mobility imply for the wages of farmers and barbers? Well, this implies that if they're perfectly substitutable, then you would expect that the wage is no longer a function of what industry they are, right? The wage will be the same. So notice that this one can be well, notice the left-hand side. This is the value of the marginal product for farmers. It has to equal the wage. And this is the same thing as this one, except now we've removed the subscript for the workers, for the wage, I should say. And then on the right-hand side, the wage for the barbers must be equal to the value of the marginal product. It's called value because P, or the price of the output of the barbers, times the marginal product of labor amongst the barbers. And that's just a peso value here and the peso value here. And of course, the wage is also a peso value, peso per labor. Okay, so this is now in terms of money or money per worker, right? And we've assumed that labor can move from one sector to the next, and therefore, in equilibrium, the wages must be equated, right? Next question. What do your previous answers imply for the price of haircuts relative to the price of food? Okay. So what does this mean for the price of haircuts, PB? Okay, that's right. That's the output of barbers' haircuts. And here's the food for farmers, price of food. So what would this imply for that? So notice all of your previous answers. So all that this basically implies this one, if you notice. And then this one can further be simplified by saying the following. Okay. Is this correct? No, this is opposite. So I invite you guys to make sure that you understand what's happening here. This is a fraction, PB over PF, and that's equal to MPLF over MPLB, right? And it's the same as the second line here because I just moved all the P's to one side and all the MPLs to the other side. Now, what did we assume earlier? We assumed that MPL has risen and MPLF has risen, MPLB has remained flat. So this goes up. And that means this goes up as well. So that means that the price of haircuts relative to food goes up. Okay. So there's a relationship between the ratio of marginal products to the ratio of prices. So who benefits from technological progress in farming, farmers or barbers? Okay. What we've shown here is that the real wage of barbers definitely has gone up, right? The real wage of farmers with respect to, well, sorry, go back. The real wage of farmers has gone up because the productivity of farmers has gone up for sure, right? This one goes up. But for barbers, they also benefit actually, because even if their productivity does not change, what did you notice? What did you notice? When it's come time to buy food or PF, the price of food has actually fallen relative to PB. So in terms of PB or haircuts, it's the same, right? Nothing has happened. But if it's W over PF, because PF has fallen relative to PB, then even for barbers, their welfare has risen because now food is cheaper and their real wage in terms of food. So you have the real wage W. So in this case, W is the same, yeah? W over PF and W over PB, right? So it's sure, right? That in terms of food, the real wage has gone up, but in terms of um, W over PB, the real wage has fallen, right? So it depends on what people will tend to consume, right? Will tend to consume. Either it's haircuts or food. If it's haircuts, then that means the price of haircuts has risen relative to food. And that means given our assumption of W here, W over PB, that will have fallen. And because PF has fallen relative to PB, then that means you have a smaller price of food, but the real wage in terms of food has risen. Okay. So it depends on what people tend to consume, right? Again, this assumes that W is the same, that people can move from one industry to the next, right? You can imagine a separate answer, for example, if that's not the case. And in this particular case, you'd have to think about it a little more, and maybe that's the challenge moving forward. But for this particular case, when you have a homogeneous labor force, W will essentially be constant. And what this is saying is that W over PF must go up because PF is now smaller than before, and W over PB will have gone up, sorry, gone down because PB is higher, right? W over PB will go down because PB is higher. So your real wage in terms of food and haircuts will be different. All right. Let's answer this one, right? The government raises taxes by 100 billion. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.6. What happens to the following? Do they rise or fall, and by what amounts? First, public saving. Let's insert a text box first. So public saving, that happens to be T minus G, right? In this particular case, T goes up by G, therefore T rises by 100. So public savings, public, I should say the change in equals 100. That is, it went up. Yep. So public saving went up. Now, what about private saving? So private savings, okay, equals Y minus consumption minus taxes, okay? So what happens to that? So first, note that consumption will fall by 0.6 times 100 or 600, right? Because if T goes up by 100, that means disposable income will fall by 100. So this is the change in disposable income. And consumption will go down here by 0.6. Once C will go down by 6. Therefore, so that's it. Change in C is, or change in C equals 600. Okay. And therefore, private saving equals Y equals, or the change in private saving, is going to be negative 600. That's coming from consumption. Okay, because consumption will fall because public disposable income will fall as taxes went up. Okay, but it now will have plus 100 from increase in fee. So this is basically, sorry, 60, not 600. So the total increase in saving will be negative 60 plus 100, that is 40. So national saving, change in national saving is 40. So it's positive, right? Um, uh, oh, hold on. That's minus 100, I should say. And this is, sorry, minus 160. Okay, so notice that it's minus from 60 because consumption will fall by this amount, actually. So this is a positive 60, and that's 100. So this is minus 40. Okay. So let's review this again. The change in private saving is positive 60, right? Because C will fall by this amount, or the change in C is negative 60, right? But since C comes in with a negative value, the change in private saving will be negative times negative, or positive 60. Now the T will goes up by 100, so it's negative 100. So that's minus 100 here. So minus 100 plus 60, it's negative 40. Okay. So the change in national saving is minus 40. That's from private saving. And then it's going to be plus 100 from public saving, which happens to equal to 60. Because it's 100 minus 40 is equal to 60. And therefore, the change in investment must also be equal to 60. And you can add here, finally, that if that's the case, then if investment rises, then R, or the real interest rate, must fall. But the cost of investing has to fall. Okay, so this is basically the same thing as this example here, just to point out. A decrease in taxes was considered in the text. In the homework, an increase in taxes was considered by the text. So, and if you have an increase in taxes, what will happen ultimately is national savings will go up. It will shift the savings curve to the right, and therefore investment must go up. And to have investment go up, then the real interest rate must fall. Okay, and then as I promised, the last thing I'll talk about is this is the theory again of national income determination. So we should return to the case of the married butler. Yeah. So what we've got here is here's Y, which is real GDP or income. And on the right-hand side, you've got consumption by the wife and consumption by the butler. So this is the sort of initial state, right? The wife has this income, and some of this income is used to consume stuff, right? And pay for the butler. So the consumption of the wife is also here in terms of the butler. The consumption, some of this consumption will turn into income for the butler. And then that income for the butler will turn into the butler's own consumption. Right? So this is the initial situation. You've got income from both, right? And then consumption of both, right? So the key in this chapter, in chapter 3, is that the sum of CW, or the woman, and the butler is Y, because all factors are employed and are working, and all output is unchanged, right? So in this case, they get married. He does the same work, and she doesn't buy housekeeping services. So in this case, what YW plus YB equals Y still. Okay, so nothing happened to the total output in the economy. But now that same income, which is now the sum of YB and what used to be separated into two parts is now just the one part. And as we said, it's unchanged because Y is a function of all of the inputs. It's still going to be divided amongst the consumption of the butler and consumption of the wife. Okay. In other words, it's still the same income. It will just be divided differently or the same, but whatever it is, the aggregate consumption can remain the same right? On the other hand, actually, this is sort of incomplete. It's possible that the aggregate consumption falls, right? So you can imagine, for instance, after getting married, their preferences change and they want to save more. Therefore, the sum of their consumption will fall and they tend to save more for the future, and that will tend to raise investment. So that's just one situation, right? Generally, what this equation is supposed to say is that since the left-hand side is unchanged, the right-hand side will also be unchanged. Notice that the same case is true after they get married. He doesn't do the same work and she continues to buy housekeeping services. So this time, the division of income, instead of butler, it becomes other butler, right? And in this case, your consumption will be divided to three things: consumption of the wife, consumption of the butler, and consumption of the other butler. And again, the key here is that Y is unchanged, and it's really just the apportionment of the Y amongst the different buckets. You can also imagine that their preferences change. So once they get married, they're again saving, blah, blah, blah. It becomes saving and it turns into investment. Okay. Because again, the market for the goods and services is equivalent to the market for loanable funds. Okay, they're two sides of the same coin. In fact, the only way for for GDP to fall is no one does the work, and the woman doesn't raise her consumption. So basically, it's as if the only way it happens is if the butler himself sort of disappears and doesn't need to consume anymore, in which case the income falls. So the left-hand side will fall, and the right-hand side will also fall. So that hinges on the fact that if the butler, the only way for that to happen is that if there's real resources that goes away, if the butler just disappears, right? And then no work is done, no new butler services are had, right? And consumption and income just basically falls across the board. That is this particular model. So there is at least two models of GDP determination. This is the quote-unquote long run model of GDP determination. And before the midterm, we will be doing or discussing another model of income determination. All right, so on Thursday, we will continue with chapter 4. All right, thank you.